The U.S. has vetoed an Arab-backed resolution in the UN Security Council demanding a ceasefire in the war between Israel and Hamas, which is labeled a terrorist organization in many countries. China and even U.S. ally France criticized Washington for blocking the resolution a third time. The U.K. abstained in the vote, while 13 voted in favor. The U.S. instead proposed its own plan. The new American draft resolution calls for a temporary ceasefire linked to the release of hostages held by Hamas. And here's what China's ambassador had to say about Washington's veto.
It was the veto exercised by the United States that stifled Council consensus. The U.S. veto sent the wrong message, pushing the situation in Gaza into more dangerous territory.
Well, joining me for more on this now is DW correspondent James Chater from our East Asia Bureau in Taiwan. James, I know you heard what China said about the U.S. position regarding the ceasefire resolution. What do you make of what China is saying about the U.S. here?
Well, of course, it's important to look at what China's statement is getting at here through the lens of great power competition that Beijing is engaged with Washington in multiple spheres around the world. What Beijing seems to be inferring here is that Washington can no longer be viewed as the sole kind of responsible leader of the international community, and especially that when it comes to issues of grave humanitarian concern, that the US can no longer be trusted as a moral authority. This is something that, of course, Beijing seeks to propagate in many spheres around the world, and particularly here in the Indo-Pacific when you look at US policy with various countries around the Asia-Pacific, for example, expanding military ties with Japan or the Philippines. What China, in pushing back against Washington's aims in these parts of the world, tries to get across is that Washington is never really acting in the interests of those countries that it's entering partnerships with, but that is solely kind of acting in its own interest. And I think what China's looking to do here, while the optics are quite bad, of course, Washington, the only country voting against this ceasefire proposal, is to make the case once again, as it has done in multiple arenas around the world, that the US can no longer really be trusted to be the singular authority when it comes to grave issues of universal rights and particularly humanitarian issues.
So China is saying that the U.S. is operating only in its own interest, but what about China itself? Because economically and diplomatically, China has been getting more and more involved in the Middle East. It's repeatedly called for a ceasefire in Gaza without explicitly condemning the Hamas terror attacks of October 7th. Where do Beijing's interests lie in this conflict in and around Gaza?
Well, of course, Beijing has historically expressed positions which are relatively kind of pro-Palestinian. That's because of what Beijing calls its anti-colonial stance. But it's important to point out, of course, despite what I've just said about the US and its the position it kind of has entered into in voting against this proposal, that Beijing really hasn't been putting forward any kind of concrete diplomatic proposals of its own to kind of find a solution and a way out of this crisis. Of course, that was really expected, actually, given we saw that China was looking to take on a more active role in the Middle East, brokering that peace agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia in March last year. But we really can't expect, the leadership, the diplomatic leadership from China hasn't really come. China really is looking to act in its own interests here, big oil interests. Half of its oil imports come from the Middle East, and of course big trading relationship with many countries in the Middle East, and those trading routes which have come under fire from Houthi rebels in the Red Sea. China looking to make overtures to Iran to rein in the Houthis when it comes to that issue as well.
James, thank you very much. That was our correspondent James Chater in Taipei.